Welcome back, everybody, to Aaron's Opinion. Tonight, we are extremely pleased and honored to be joined by Eyes on Success, Peter and Nancy Torpey. First of all, I just want you to know how appreciative I am that you've taken the time to come to Aaron's Opinion today. Much appreciated. I've known of your podcast and show for years, for quite a while. Never really gotten around to reaching out to you with all the work and podcasting that I do. And so thank you for being here. It's going to be a really fascinating conversation. I'll start the episode like I start all of them by saying, who is Peter and Nancy Torpey? And you guys may address it and answer it in any way you want. And then from that question, you can talk about your lives, all of the different interesting things you've done, and then work towards Eyes on Success, and I'll help you out along the way. So go ahead.
Well, I guess first of all, we are both married, as many of our listeners know.
I, I,
To
I,
each other.
I guessed that, considering with the same last name, I guessed. Yes.
We've been married for almost 40 years. We have 2 children and 2 grandchildren. And we're retired scientists, as many of our listeners also know. I have been partially blind since birth and fully blind since maybe the mid 80s or so. And Nancy is fully sighted.
But I have a lot of experience hanging around with a blind guy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's really fascinating. So I didn't specifically know that you were scientists. I did not anticipate that I would ask this question. What area of science did you work in? And I just have to ask, what do you think of all these great new discoveries from NASA and the James Webb Telescope? What do you think about all of that?
Oh, well, let's answer the last question first. All of these exciting discoveries from the James Webb Telescope are really, really cool. And in a couple of days, we'll be interviewing the people who created the alt text description of those
Excellent.
images so that people who rely on screen readers can get the full meaning of those photographs.
Right. So good. So good.
But anyway, so you asked us what kind of scientists we were. Pete's PhD is in fluid mechanics, and mine is in semiconductor physics. But we both spent our entire careers working at Xerox Corporation, where we were working on next generation printers and copiers.
It's really important.
It was a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
It was a lot of fun. I tell people that when I was a kid, I used to play all these mathematical games and puzzles, and I'm sure Nancy did too.
Oh, I did.
And then someone paid us to do that. So it almost wasn't like work. It was just a lot of fun. They gave us all the tools to have fun with science and learn new things and keep learning as we were working.
Well, that's really important. That's really good. Now, in my case, I have glaucoma and a congenital heart defect. But Pete, what about you? You said that you've been blind your whole life, I think, for a significant part of your life. How did you come to lose your vision?
So I was born in 1952 with congenital glaucoma.
Oh,
And back then, they didn't know it could happen in kids because it's usually associated with being an older person's eye problem, which is why they check older people's eye pressure when they reach 40.
right.
You don't seem very old yourself, so you must have had some sort of juvenile glaucoma.
Oh, are you saying? Oh, are you? Do you mean that I don't seem so? Well, actually, I'm 31.
Which is
So
not over 40.
right. So I was okay. So I was born in 91, of course, and I have Peter's anomaly syndrome. So I had the glaucoma when, of course, when I was born, cataracts and things like that. And then also it affected my heart too. So I also have those two things, the glaucoma and the congenital heart defect.
So it was
Right.
pretty apparent when you were born that you had those issues, I suppose.
Considering when I came out that my corneas were white.
Got it.
So,
See, my issue was, first of all, it wasn't well known that infants could have
of
glaucoma.
course
And
not.
second of all, it's kind of a silent killer of eyes. No one knew I had glaucoma. It took the better part of a year to figure that out.
Of
My
course.
symptom was we were living in Texas at the time. My dad was in the Army at Fort Bliss there. And my mother would take me out into the sun and I would squint and start crying. And after a couple of months of that, she would take me to the doctor, say, I think there's something wrong with my kid. And
Hmm.
he'd say, well, I think you just have a colicky kid. If he cries, he just cries and, soothe him. But, light sensitivity is one of the signs of glaucoma. So she just learned to put a big sombrero on me and avoid the sun. But after a while, someone finally figured out what was going on.
And, that's very understandable because medicine has grown tremendously throughout my life of 30 years. So to be born in the 1950s, medicine, I mean, nothing personal, but medicine, ophthalmology was primitive in the 1950s as to how much more advanced it is today. So it's completely understandable that they didn't really understand it nearly as well in the 50s. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes.
But even by the mid 1980s, when our children were born, because Pete's condition is hereditary,
Right.
we took them to the local glaucoma specialist and we said, check them out.
Yeah.
And they're both fine.
Oh,
But
that's
they were
good.
checked at a couple of weeks old.
So with that's really really interesting. And then how? I mean, if you were born in the 50s, you were in university in the 70s, roughly upper 60s to 70s. So if you don't mind me asking, how was it? What are some things that you can tell me that really stood out to you about going to university and needing to be a successful blind person in that time period, going through university and still getting your PhD? What can you tell me about that?
Well, so I almost consider myself fortunate that I was blind since I was a child. Until I went to graduate school, I could hold a book several inches from my nose and read it. I didn't use a cane, although I probably should have when I was crossing streets in particular and at night.
Hmm.
So I had a good sense of the world. And because I was blind since birth, I was plugged into all the services and adaptive aids. Plus, being kind of a geek, I like technology. And as you know, the technologies got better and better for blind people to deal with the world around them these days. So by the time I got to graduate school, I was well aware of Recording for the Blind, which is now Learning Ally. And I had all of my books taped, my quantum mechanics books, my mathematical physics books, and they recorded those books for me. And fortunately, by the time I got to graduate school, my eyesight cleared up and they were just starting to make those CCTVs, closed circuit
Hmm.
TVs that blew up print really big, like, maybe 4 inches high with lots of contrast. So I was able to do my work that way.
Well,
Really
and to
good.
backtrack from that, when you were in high school and college, you basically used a small telescope to see the board, but for everything else, you just kind of got your head really close to it. And before that, you went to a school for the blind.
Yeah, I went to a school for the blind until I was in fifth grade, I guess. So I knew some Braille skills, although I hadn't used them in a long time, but I could fall back on those for taking short notes and dealing with things. I learned to use a cane. I went blind due to an operation just before I started graduate school, the summer before graduate school. And that's when I reacquainted myself with my Braille skills. I learned to use a cane. I said, look, I'm going to graduate school just because I lost my vision. There are ways of doing this.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's really interesting that you remember holding books closer to your face. In my case, I do not have enough vision for that. And I was always a braille reader and it was never for me by the time that I was going through school, it was never appropriate really to hold a book up to your face. If you're blind, you use braille and things. And then as technology changed, we're into more of a digital audio age now. But yeah, a lot of blind people that I talk to still use their usable vision in some ways at certain times. I think it can be good, but it also depends on exactly what you're using your vision for and things.
Well,
So,
I learned that when I
mhm.
was learning my cane lessons. I had I was starting to develop some light sensitivity and maybe a little bit of vision. I could see the contrast between the sidewalk and the grass. And when I was learning my cane lessons, I figured, oh, I ought to blindfold myself. I'm blind,
Right,
I
of
use a cane.
course.
And their point was, you use all the tools and resources around you. If you can see a little bit, learn to use that. It's an extra help. And I take that view with kind of everything I do. I try to make myself aware of a variety of tools. And depending on the task I'm doing, I may use this tool or that tool. And at least you have a choice of what is going to be the appropriate tool, or maybe some combination of tools.
Right, absolutely.
The more tools you know about, the better you're able to deal with some kind of task or problem, I think.
Oh, sure. Sure, sure, sure. And then what can you tell me about your experience, going through your PhD and then after your PhD when you started to work, as you said, for Xerox? What can you tell me about some of those fascinating experiences?
Well, it's interesting. When I started graduate school, I told you I prepared the summer before to have recording for the blind, make my quantum mechanics books and mathematical physics books, etc. But they weren't always coming in on time. And so I didn't have the books the first few months of graduate school. But all my graduate colleagues were very willing to read into tape cassettes, and they read books to me. And, it was very kind of them. And, they all wanted to do it. They all wanted to volunteer. They learned how hard it was to read mathematics. It's not like reading prose. You have to be very careful with the parentheses and what expression is over what expression, etc. It's difficult. They also learned that your throat gets very dry after reading for a half an hour.
It does.
So
It
everybody
certainly
was
does.
really supportive in graduate school. It was a very good place. And then when I was looking for a job, I really didn't think of myself as blind because I was doing all the things a graduate school student does. I was doing the research and, managed to do the kinds of things I needed to do, the computer work and all. So I really didn't think of myself as blind. I sent out resumes. I didn't mention that I was blind at all. And so
Right.
people started calling up for interviews. And I remember with my interview at Xerox, they said, okay, make a ticket get a ticket for a flight to Rochester, New York, and, let us know when you're coming in, and we'll pick you up at the airport. And I said, good. You look for me. I'm the guy with the white cane. They said, white cane? And I said, yeah, I'm blind. Oh, yeah. And after I hired at Xerox, I asked them, I said, didn't you have any reticence about hiring a blind person? Because obviously I spent the day there interviewing, talking to people, and going through the facility. And they said, I thought my manager, my hiring manager, was very open-minded at the time. He said, I knew you were blind, of course. You're using a cane, you couldn't see anything. He says, but I figured if you got your PhD being blind, that wasn't an issue. And they were just interested in my technical ability.
Precisely. I think, and I hope, and I really want to stress that I want listeners to listen to that basically last couple sentences you said, because this is a huge problem for my generation, is that blind people are not using their blindness as an asset. And that's what you did. You used your blindness as an asset to prove why Xerox needed to hire you, basically. And also in a similar sense, you used your blindness so that Xerox would hire you regardless of your blindness. We have a serious, serious problem now with a lot of blind people are not getting hired just because they're blind. And I'm only giving out my opinion, and I hope to make it an interesting conversation. You'll disagree with me a little. But I think as technology has increased, one of the downsides is that sometimes it can be easier for some companies to overlook blind people and to just simply throw out a resume just because it's easier. And we have technology to kind of decline certain things very quickly now if we don't like people. But what's your philosophy about that? And also, what's your philosophy about disclosing disability and blindness in a workplace setting? Because a lot of blind people my age are asking these types of questions in the various groups that I'm in. What do you think?
So I'd just like to start by saying
Sure.
we agree with everything you just said. One of the things we do on Eyes on Success is we interview blind people with meaningful careers. And it is astonishing how much trouble even skilled blind people have getting hired. And I think the real problem is that the hiring managers just don't get it. They're not willing to take a chance. People who graduated near the top of their law school class and they're doing fine now, but they're working for blindness organizations, which is a meaningful career, but they couldn't get hired by any other law firm.
I agree with you. I think my opinion, because it's an opinion show, just to a greater extent, well, it says so on the title of the episode, but I actually think that that's a big problem, that blind people oftentimes are drawn to work for blindness organizations, because I think it would give, not you, Nancy, in particular, but I think it would give most sighted people the idea that blind people cannot work with sighted people. If sighted people see blind people always working for blindness organizations, I think that is a reflection on what's really going on. What's your theory about that?
Well, and that's partially, as Nancy says, the reason we do our show. This is kind of our way of giving back. We like to interview lots of blind professionals with interesting careers, be it in oceanography or astronomy, and just working for ordinary companies. And I think people need to know the example. First of all, the blind people need to know the example that, hey, I don't have to be selling pencils. I can have a real job wherever I want a job if I just get the skills required for the job and put myself out there. And then also to sighted employers, they have to see that, hey, here are successful blind people that are making real contributions to commercial establishments. So it works both ways. You need the success stories to get out there for people to realize what's going on and that things can work.
Right.
So
Right.
I know creating a weekly podcast is an awful lot of work, but do you have a regular job in addition to the
I
podcast?
I do, and I love it when guests on my show start to take over and interview me. That's so touching. I just get a huge kick out of that. Thank you. Yeah, I'm a teacher. I work online. I tell people that I work for Company X. It's probably some company out in Silicon Valley, and I teach English as a second language. So I speak all day, and I'll tell you kind of a cute story. I was born in the early 90s, so when I was a little boy, going mostly back and forth to hospitals on many different occasions, my mother or father would be listening to talk radio of the 90s. Various great variety of hosts. One of them passed away last year, but very, very famous hosts in specific media circles, what have you. And anyway, from the age of about 2, I was constantly listening to things, listening to conversations, listening to content. And that's what I've done my whole life. I've always been someone who loves to educate people, and I just love to talk. I just love to talk and talk and talk and talk. And then I started my teaching job, and all I do all day is a job that I love, talk and talk and talk and talk. And I was doing a lot of teaching, and in between, I was listening to a variety of podcasts around the blindness community. I was not aware of 7 years ago, I was not aware of your podcast at that moment, but I was listening to other podcasts. And I really felt, Nancy and Pete, that a lot of these other podcasts around the community were really not open to guests and open to opinions and open to conversations. And I disagreed with that. So I figured out that since I can't stop talking, and the more I talk, the happier I get, why don't I go to all of these Facebook groups for blind people? And each time a blind person asks a question that annoys everybody else, I'll just write an audio memo back to the person answering their question. I kept on doing it and doing it and doing it until it occurred to me that that's a podcast. I'm answering a question, and the person who posts the question is the audience. And then I just kept on doing it until accidentally I ended up with an opinion. Aaron's opinion. So that's my job outside of podcasting. Yes.
That is a fun story.
So is that through some sort of corporate entity, or is a school system, or what?
It's Company X, as I call it, privately speaking. Yeah, Company X would be a corporate, like it would be a corporate company. Yeah.
So you teach their staff English
So
if that's not their first
I
language.
teach their students. So it's a platform that students from all over the world would come to, and they have a similar conversation, a Zoom-ish, Skype-ish conversation. And then the student buys minutes. The company pays me based on how long I talk, and I've been doing that for 7 years. Yeah. So that's how it
Cool.
works. Most of my students are from Turkey, Asia, Middle East, Saudi Arabia, and I speak French too. I'm also a French speaker. So it's I have a tremendous interest in communication and using language to educate people. So it's pretty powerful.
Well, it sounds like you're doing something you really enjoy.
I
I
I
always
do, I
like to see people
tremendously
doing a job they like.
I appreciate you saying it, Pete. I really want you to know two things. Yes, I love being a teacher. I just adore teaching. It's just that's what makes me happy, and that's good for me. But I also want to stress, I also want to emphasize to both of you and to the audience that as I'm seeing more and more of these posts around the blindness community, I'm getting more and more concerned about the younger generations of blind people that are not finding careers that they like or at all. And, everybody in my family is very long living, especially most people in my family live into their upper 90s. So I'm going to be around for a while. I'm worried about these future generations of blind people that are really, in many cases, being taken advantage of by other people and are not being given the same opportunities that I was to be a teacher or a content creator. Not everybody needs to teach and create YouTube videos, but I don't know. I'm sure that you understand what my concern is, but over your career, what have you found, or what is your idea on what really needs to change in the blindness community, I guess? What do you guys think?
Well, that's interesting. Uh, I think certainly blind people do have to work a little bit harder to find the employment they like.
Hmm.
Things are certainly not quite as easy for them because we have to overcome some stereotypes that other people have. And also, certain jobs aren't open to us. For example, you know, even with a PhD, I can't drive a truck. I couldn't do the simple job of packing supermarket shelves or doing some of those checkout things that checkout people do. So some of those lower level jobs, I think, are very hard to get. You need some eyesight to do that. But as Nancy points out, often if you have some kind of expertise, particularly a technical background, it's easier to get a job. For example, I consider computers, there's no reason a blind person can't do anything on a computer a sighted person can do. We're at pretty much parity when you consider the access to computers that we have. And anything that can be done with a computer, a blind person can do. The technology has really made that possible these days. There's no excuse. So, okay, we have to try a little harder to get the kind of backgrounds and experience we need to get these jobs. And maybe not everybody is capable of doing that. I mean, the reason I got my job at Xerox, as Nancy said, my PhD was in fluid mechanics. Xerox happened to be looking for physicists who knew something about fluid mechanics. And that's one thing they don't teach in most physics programs. My program did. And so I was a natural fit for the job. So I had the kind of expertise that fit into their desires, what they were looking for. And I think you have to look at what you want to do in life and have to get the training that's appropriate for the position that you're seeking.
Absolutely. Both of you, by the way, I've noticed as a avid podcast consumer, never mind about a podcast creator myself, but as a consumer of podcasts, I've always appreciated the beautiful way that both of you speak. Both of you are so pleasant to listen to and have you guys are such a great listen. I have to ask, did either one of you take like classes in like public speaking or anything like that? Because both of you are so clear and have such a beautiful way of talking. Where did you learn how to talk like that?
Practice, practice, practice.
That's what I tell
We've
people.
been doing this
But that's what I tell
podcast.
people too. I tell people keep practicing. I thought you would give me a better answer than practice. I thought you'd have more magic than more of a magical equation than practice, practice.
Well, we started doing this podcast almost 12 years ago. And
And why did you start? So let's get into the history of Eyes on Success. Why don't you break it all down? Really break down the equation of Eyes on Success. What do you think?
Well, let me answer your last question first. When we first started, we were just being aired over our local radio reading service, and there might have been a couple of hundred people listening. So the first 6 months or a year was basically practice. We knew there weren't that many people listening, but what the heck? Somebody was listening, so we kept doing it. And the other thing is we heavily edit our audio, and we figured out that it was a lot easier if you just said it right the first time and you didn't have to edit out the bloopers. So we've kind of trained ourselves into speaking the way we do.
And then I think also we listen to examples. I mean, we're avid listeners of NPR, National Public Radio. And we listened to the Diane Reeves show. Wow, she's a great interviewer. How does she do that? What makes her special? When you listen to the news announcers on NPR, they sound great. What makes them special? And, what could they have done better? Or when they screw up, why did they screw up? And so, you kind of pick your role models and you kind of model yourself after that. Also, being in corporate research for a long time, we were used to giving presentations, and when you had a career giving presentations, you learn how to give a good presentation, how to talk in a logically straight line, how to answer what you think people's questions are going to be before they ask them. And so we've had some experience there, but it does take time. It took us a while to
Definitely
find our voices on the podcast.
Definitely. It's taken me 3 years to get to this point.
Yes.
It takes, and that's another huge problem now with, I think that there would be more blind people getting into YouTube or podcasting, but they just feel so insubstantial. They just feel like the people at the top of the system are going to totally drown them out. So I think a lot more people would be involved in this, but they don't feel they have a voice, and that's a huge problem. Definitely. Yeah.
Well, and I think a lot of people, blind or sighted, are intimidated by the technology. I mean, we've had to learn quite a bit in order to make our podcast what it is.
Right.
Also, I think people are intimidated in what seem to be big problems, right? Like learning a new instrument. You don't all of a sudden learn the piano and start playing Beethoven sonatas. First you learn the notes, then you learn the scales, you learn how to hold your fingers. It's a long process. The same with the podcast. You jump in, you can sit in front of a microphone, but maybe it takes a few years to figure out how to do it right. And it just takes time. And I think people, they get kind of antsy. They kind of lose their patience. They want to be a success right away. It takes time to.
Then they'll never be a success.
To get an expert.
The saddest thing of all is that's what people don't really understand about being successful. Is if you want to be successful, it's really slow. It's right. As a comedian once said, I don't know who said it, but I'll say it because it's both funny and true. I have a get rich slow scheme for you.
Yes.
Which is what life is. Life is just a get rich slow scheme. It really is. Right. There's no fast anything. Everything is super slow.
Right. And getting a PhD is much like that. A lot of getting a PhD is patience. You're working on a problem that isn't going to be solved overnight or in a week or even a year. You're working on a problem that's going to take a long time to learn about, to study, to go down the wrong path a few times. And after 3 or 4 years of doing research, you finally come up with an answer that you can publish and get your degree from. So you learn patience just going for a PhD.
Well, and in addition to patience, persistence, because it does take several years.
Yes.
Absolutely. You mentioned the importance of being an active problem solver, and I think that's a great life skill and just a great skill. So if you can pick, Pete, if you can pick only one problem that you would want to solve for society using all of your knowledge in fluid mechanics, what is a specific problem that you still want to tackle today, and how would it change the lives of all people for the better?
In fluid mechanics?
Or in other words, how, if you can pick a problem that you're seeing right now in society, obviously I can tell, it's clear to me that you're the type of person that spends a lot of time gathering knowledge, reading things, listening to things, getting more knowledgeable about everything. Surely you see a lot of problems around the universe and world. If you can pick one problem to solve, the one problem that you said, I'm glad I solved that for people. What problem in the world do you want to solve?
Well, I had fun making better printers for people. It may not be solving world hunger or the environmental crisis that we're facing these days, but my attitude is some big problems, they just take a long time and they're many faceted. And so you chip away at it where you can and where you enjoy chipping away at it. The reason I became a physicist was because I wanted to do good things for the world. We have all this technology, and I figured, we can apply that even in little ways to make people's lives better. And a lot of little things add up to a big thing. I can't solve the environmental crisis overnight, but I can make a better printer for people if that makes their life easier.
Making a printer better, that really makes democracy better. Arguably the most important invention of the last 1,000 years was, of course, the printing press. So you saying that you made printers better, well, basically you made democracy better when you actually think about it. Yeah, definitely.
We're honored to have you phrase it like that.
Well, thank you. How would you honor yourselves in phrasing it?
Well, but as I say, I think a lot of little things add up. Now that I'm retired, I spend a lot of time these days writing scripts, JAWS scripts for programs to make them more accessible to other blind people, and I give them away. We do the podcast as a way of making people's lives better or opening their eyes to opportunities. So there's a lot of little things like that. Again, it's not, solving any big crisis around the world, but hopefully it makes lives better bit by bit and one life at a time.
Or as I say here on Aaron's Opinion, help one person today, help 1 million people tomorrow. It's about helping the next person. I did see that
on your website, I think, yes.
It's about helping. It really, if you can only get, as I say, if you can only help one person, that's a huge help. Or if you can only improve a little bit, well, you might have just improved a lot,
Right.
Yeah.
What about teaching? A lot of people with your background, get back into teaching after they retire. Do you ever lecture at the universities?
We've each been to many technical conferences and given many technical presentations, but for about 25 years while we were at Xerox, they had a program that we were very active in where they would give employees not only the time off during the day, but all the materials we needed to go into the elementary schools and teach science lessons. Because
cool, good.
Wonderful as elementary school teachers are, they didn't have the equipment and they didn't have the background. And we would go in year after year after year and motivate, sometimes we'd do 4 different classes. That would be 100 10-year-old kids. Science can be fun. And maybe they'd learn something tangible, but if all they picked up was science can be fun, and they can use their creativity and their curiosity to try to solve problems, some of those kids were going to grow up to get an education and hopefully a career in something meaningful to them. And it didn't escape us that we would walk in, the science guys are here. And one of us was a woman, which is not what stereotypical scientists are. And the other one was blind. And at the end of the year, we would do what we irreverently called Pete's Blind Act. And, it's like, okay, I did all this and I can't see. What's your excuse?
What are some of the most endearing, do you remember, because children have no filter, Of course, I barely have a filter either, but that's another story. Children don't really have a filter for some of the things they say. What were some fascinating or endearing or really hysterically funny things some of the children might have said to you, Pete, or you, Nancy? I'm sure you remember at least one kid, or Freddie, or someone like that. I'm sure you've got to remember something like that.
I have a favorite if you don't. Do you have a
Oh,
favorite?
I have a favorite. It was the time we got the entire fourth grade together in the auditorium for Pete's blind act because the timing was tight and there were 100 kids in the room. Right?
Yeah, that was the one.
Go
And
ahead.
what
And
happened?
and after I showed them how I use the computer, it talked, and I taught them a little about Braille, how I read, how I tell time. And it was question time. And one kid raises his hand. He says, "But Mr. Torpey, how do you know what you're wearing?" And of course, the answer was supposed to be I put Braille labels on my shirts and ties. So, I knew what colors things were. But I turned around to him and I said, well,
Well, then he
I
asked,
can
how do
tell.
you know what I'm wearing?
Right. And I said, well, I can't really tell what you're wearing. I know what I'm wearing. For all I know, I said to the kid, you could be naked. And you could hear all the heads in the room turn to him. And you could hear this kid turn red.
I think he's still embarrassed. It had to be 20 years ago.
That's as in that's you got do you guys know that I love to laugh like that? Do you guys know that you were trying to get me to laugh really hard like that?
We did not.
Well, now you know. That is like that's a really beautiful answer, like with the innuendo, with like the sexuality, with like that's not really like that's really cute because that's not really appropriate to say that to a 10-year-old.
Right.
But it's
right.
a really good, it's a really cogent response. It's a really good analogy to paint the absurdity of that child asking an absurd question of, well, you put your shirt on, you're wearing a shirt, right? It's kind of like that. I mean, I get it as an adult, but a child wouldn't get the absurdity. That's a very complex sense of humor,
But pretty
yeah.
much every group of kids that we did the blind act for, somebody in the room, when it came to questions and answers, would say, how do you brush your teeth? And every single time he'd say, your homework for tonight, when you go to brush your teeth, close your eyes, see if you can get the toothbrush in your mouth. And it's like some of this stuff, it's really pretty easy even if you can't see. There's other things that are maybe more challenging, but how do you tie your shoes? And they'd ask these questions, and it's a great age because I think one issue I have with society is that the adults have all been socialized out of even admitting that they recognize that you have a disability.
You're right.
You know,
You're right, Nancy.
they certainly don't ask questions about it. But these kids, we raised the topic. Pete described, this is how I do all of this stuff that you might find surprising that he's able to do. What other questions do you have? And at age 10, they just asked whatever. They were very comfortable, which is great. But, another 10, 20 years, they won't be asking anything.
Yeah, adults just won't do that. I worked at Xerox for many years. People saw me in meetings, giving presentations, running meetings, doing all kinds of work. And it wasn't until Bring Your Child to Work Day, where they take their children from office to office or lab to lab to, see what a work is like, that they'd come in and they'd see how I did my work in Braille and my talking computer. And they'd say, "Oh, is that how you do your work?" But it would never occur to them to ask.
Right. That's interesting. That's interesting.
And only
Go ahead.
slightly more socially acceptable was asking the wife of the blind guy. I can't tell you how many people would stop me in the hall. How does Pete do this? How does Pete do that? And then heaven help us when Xerox switched from DOS to Windows, his closest colleagues and the, guys he had lunch with 5 days a week cornered me in the hall. They're like, now Pete's sunk. I'm like, look, I don't know how he's going to do it, but trust me, he'll find a way, he'll make it work.
Right. Absolutely.
But they weren't going to ask him.
Yeah, I get that a lot too, or if I'm with family and we're in public, they would say like what does he want or things like that. And as you can tell, or maybe not, hopefully not tell, is that actually when I'm not teaching and podcasting, I'm actually very unfriendly and quite antisocial. So I can understand where people would be kind of odd about that and being kind of resonant, I guess, in asking those types of questions. But I have to wonder, I have to be a little bit facetious and wonder, so what did that student's parents think when you said that you could be naked for all I know? What did their parents think of you saying that?
Oh, the parents weren't there.
Right, I know. I was just wondering, just being facetious, and wondering if the parents ever found out that you said that to their child.
I would be really surprised if he brought it up.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Probably the kid was so embarrassed or so confused he didn't even say anything more about it when he got home from school. Yeah,
the rest of the class probably told the entire school bus.
Right.
But
right.
I would be surprised if he brought it up at home.
That would be an interesting story to reconnect with that kid and say, hey, well, now you're successful. I mean, imagine that could be like a successful person in life. And they would say, hey, do you remember when I said that to you? And the person would probably still remember. Probably they would, ironically. But so Eyes on Success. You've been podcasting for a while. What would you say you would like your impact to be? Or really, how would you describe the flavor, the listening experience of Eyes on Success to someone who doesn't know what it is?
Well, we usually start by saying that we talk about products, services, and daily living stories.
Yeah, but what does that even mean? Like, to me, okay, in all honesty, to me, product services and like that, as a blind person, that doesn't mean much to me. Not that I'm not saying it's meaningless. I'm just saying to me that doesn't hold much to me. So what does that mean? Product, services, and daily. What do you mean?
Well, I was going to go on to say really kind of the mission of the show is captured by the name, Eyes on Success. So every show is a success story in some sense. If we're talking about the latest features of some piece of access technology, that's a tool you can use to be successful. Or we'll talk to people who have hobbies or sports or careers they're involved in that they've been able to succeed at. And so, we talk to a blind golfer. If you think you can't play golf just because you can't see, listen to that show and you'll find out how he did it. And maybe you'll be motivated to try it yourself. And that goes for anything from knitting to astrophysics. So we just we try to convey a positive message. We try to say, hey, if you have something you want to do, there's probably a way you can make it happen.
So we try to talk about a variety of tools and technologies that can be helpful, and then also give examples of people who have used those tools and different ways of doing things to become successful and lead rewarding lives.
Can you think of an episode where both of you really learned a tremendous amount? Or I'm sure you learn on every episode, but are there any episodes where you say like you really left your studio, left the recording thinking, wow, I really got a lot out of that? What was an example of a wow episode for both of you?
I think this was actually 2 episodes, but one of the most fun episodes we did was when we managed to get Jim Fruchterman, Dean Blasey, and Ted Henter together. And they're, real pioneers in the field of access technology. And when we got the 3 of them together talking about what was it like developing the tools that they developed, that was just so cool.
So for people who may not know them, Dean Blasey was the person who led the company, Blasey Engineering, that developed one of the first refreshable portable Braille displays. Fruchterman developed OpenBook, which is a system for doing OCR on books way back in the 80s. And Ted Henter was the person who started the JAWS screen reader program. And these guys all kind of collected together when Freedom Scientific bought the three of their companies. And it was kind of fun. They hadn't seen each other in years. We got them all together on our show just to reminisce and talk about what they were doing since retirement and how fun it was working with each other and developing those technologies to help blind people around the world.
Right, right. So that is super interesting. And then I noticed that you guys now are on YouTube. What made you want to get into YouTube and put your podcast up there on YouTube? It seems like
Thank you for asking.
Yeah.
You might wonder why we converted an audio only program into a video medium. And the reason is that an awful lot of people with vision loss, it's age related, and they also have hearing problems. And on YouTube, it's very easy to create closed captioning, and it's whatever size print you want, whatever contrast. And so for somebody who's got enough vision to be able to read the closed captions, but bad enough hearing that they need it, YouTube is the mechanism for doing that. And that's why we put it on YouTube every week.
I agree. I just think so many people now consume content both on YouTube and on podcasts that you really have to be on both. But it's really good. I find that YouTube, though, is typically a larger audience in my case, one location usually. And the podcasting audio is more smaller audiences spread out all over the globe is what I'm finding. But what have you guys found about your listener base and viewer base?
We know nothing about who watches or listens on YouTube, but we have at times tracked the people who download the podcast. And when we got up to 100 different countries, we stopped keeping track.
Well, that's
so
good.
They're all over the place.
And we try to make the podcast available in the variety of ways that people might want to listen to it. So we have it available as a podcast for people who are into podcasts. We give it to a number of radio reading services for people who just like to have those devices in their houses and aren't so tech savvy. We make it available on the Amazon and Google apps, or, so you can say, hey, Alexa, play the Eyes on Success podcast, or hey, Google, play the Eyes on Success podcast. And then we also have all of our episodes archived, which is now over 600 on our website. And I coded up a little search feature. So if you're looking for a show on any topic or someone's name, you can enter that into the search field and find the shows that match that and get links to the audio and show notes associated with that episode. So we try to make it available in the variety of ways that people might want to listen to it.
It's really good. Really, really well done. Yeah.
Oh, no.
Our Google device just answered saying that she was found all the Eyes on Success podcast. Excuse me. Hey, Google, stop. There you go. Got to watch what you say around here.
Hold on. Wait a minute. I've got to do this to you. Wait a minute. Hey, Alexa. will it work?
Yeah. Tell her to play the Eyes on Success podcast.
Play the Eyes on Success podcast.
Well, you have to say her name. You took too long between her name and.
I guess. But yeah, that is very, very interesting, and it's very easy to get those devices to easily.
Yeah, and then you can say play the previous podcast or the next podcast. Skip ahead 2 minutes. Yeah,
but I mean, I just wonder, even from my own stuff or any podcast, I wonder, do most people just listen to us through their Alexas? Or what do you suppose? I mean, even coming from your background, what would you guesstimate to be the go-to medium for consumption?
So we've looked at the Echo and Google device things. I don't think a lot of people use that yet, and our YouTube venture is a little bit too new to get a lot of visits on that. So I think a lot of our listeners come from downloading the podcast or downloading it directly from the website. The one that's very difficult to tell is all the radio reading services that broadcast it over their radio devices
Right.
and over the internet, because they don't keep statistics. They don't do the Nielsen ratings for them. So they'll tell you, oh, we have 4,000 listeners, but they never know how many are listening, or 20,000 listeners, like the Massachusetts station, right? But they never know how many are listening. And if they knew how many are listening, they don't know how many listen to your show. So it's hard to say.
Well, and the
yeah,
same with
it
the
is.
streaming services. They don't know who's listening either.
Right.
But we were honored when they made Eyes on Success a favorite on the Victor Reader stream.
I agree. That's really, it's always really, touching to me when someone comes to me and they say, Aaron, I heard an episode of Aaron's Opinion. And even when they say something simple, even the most touching thing that people say is, I listened to an episode and I really liked it. Like even telling me that they just like what I'm doing, that means so much. That's such a positive thing to say.
Absolutely. It's that feedback that keeps us going.
Even
if one listener says, I got a job, or I enjoy your show, like you said, that's great. That's great feedback.
And I would love to know. Yes, go ahead, Nancy.
The other thing that's been very gratifying is being able to make connections. Mm-hmm. So if some young person contacted us, I'm thinking of becoming a psychologist. Do you have any input for me? Well, we know nothing about being a psychologist, but we've interviewed a couple of psychologists, and we asked the psychologist in question, could we give their contact information to the young person? And the two of them got together, and that was terrific. But to take that to a whole nother level, some young woman in Malaysia wanted to be a pharmacist, and she was getting a lot of pushback from her government. You can't even sit for the exams. You can't see. What can you tell me? Well, we knew nothing, but we found some practicing pharmacist in Wisconsin. We interviewed him. We got his contact information. Right. He was blind. We got his contact information. We did the whole show. And P.S., after listening to the show and interacting directly with him, she was a real go-getter. She's still blind, but she was able to convince her government that she should be able to take the exams and get licensed as a pharmacist. And that's really gratifying, when you can put somebody who has the answer together with somebody else who has a question.
It really is. It really, really is. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. That's extremely inspirational. And some of these, I find that many blind people that listen to Aaron's Opinion are living in Asia and Africa, and I've interviewed a lot of people from those continents, and life is hard for blind people there, but quite frankly, life is hard for everyone in those countries.
Right.
It's not really Malaysia in particular. I'm not at all surprised. That is I've spoken to people. I don't think I've spoken to anyone in particular on the podcast from Malaysia, but I know of people from there, and they tell me it's a very corrupt country, a very just not an easy life in Malaysia for anyone, really. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and you think of being in the U.S. First of all, the economic lifestyle here. People have a little bit more money and resources. There's a lot of support from the government. More.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of these other countries don't even have the governmental support or the laws in place to not discriminate against blind people.
That's true, but then in my opinion, we still have a profound issue with discrimination with the laws we have in America. So I'm not sure that it's a country thing. I think the discrimination is a behavioral thing from people. People can tell the difference between things, so they can discriminate to some stretch of the imagination. Yes,
right. People need to be more open-minded.
Yes, it's worse in Malaysia, obviously, but people discriminate in every country.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Even in Canada, I've been getting a lot of complaints from Canada about all the struggles there. Goodness. Oh, God. If you guys ever interview anyone from Canada, be warned, because they are not going to say anything nice about Canada and being blind in Canada. There's nothing nice about it. They have some problems in that country, huge ones. Yeah.
We've actually interviewed several people from Canada, and I don't remember any of them whining.
Yeah, Yeah.
Well, good. Well, good. Well, so I send the whiners to Aaron's opinion, and the people that don't complain get eyes on success. I guess.
There you go.
I have to probe, and obviously you do not need to name drop on there if you don't want. But who are those people you interviewed in Canada? Just out of curiosity.
We're going to forget most of their names, but
all right.
most recently we interviewed a guy who's got a day job in IT at CNIB, but in the evenings he's a stand-up comedian.
Oh yeah. Oh, I listened. Oh, I watched that on YouTube. That was that was wonderful. That was a fascinating conversation. And I love comedy. I love, as you can tell, I love being really serious and blunt and then telling really funny stories and jokes. I love that type of thing. Yeah. That was a good one. Yeah, that was really.
But we interviewed a guy who by day is a social worker on the West Coast, and on the weekends he's playing ice hockey.
Right. Right.
So, he was happy.
I see. I see. That's all really good. We just have a few minutes left on the hour. As I say, with every episode, the hours beautifully fly by. Both of you have, goodness, that hour flew by with two people in a three-way conversation. That was even better. That was incredible. Both of you have done an incredible interview, as I knew you would. But I'm sure that each of you wants to ask me one question to really make me sweat, to see if I'm worth my salt as a podcaster. I'll go with the sighted person. Nancy, go ahead.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Really make me sweat.
I hate long gaps.
Well, you're the one that's putting them in.
Yeah.
Okay, Pete, go ahead.
So what is your biggest reward from doing your podcast?
The biggest reward from doing my podcast is that I know that with every episode, I'm helping one more person each time. I'm helping somebody, hopefully helping a blind person to just have a little bit of a better day. And that's a huge reward for me. Knowing that in my heart, I know that when I'm talking to you, I'm doing the right thing. Philosophically, spiritually, karma-wise. I know that this is what I'm supposed to be doing. This is the right thing to do. So the reward is it's the right thing to do.
Okay, so I came up with a question you're not going to like.
Good.
What's your big?
Oh, lay it on me. I can take anything.
What's your biggest challenge doing the podcast?
My biggest challenge doing the podcast is basically finding people who are amazing people like you guys who truly appreciate the value of podcasting. There's so many guests, and you guys get them too, I'm sure. And don't lie. Don't tell me you don't get these people. These people that say, "I want to be a guest on your podcast," or "No, really, I really do." And then the day comes up, and they say, "Well, no, really, you don't understand. There's something wrong with my ingrown toenail. I can't come in today," or those types of things, or I'm too scared, or stuff like that. That's actually the hardest thing about podcasting is learning how to talk to the public and learning how to have a conversation. It's really hard for me, actually. I've had to practice over 7 years of teaching and then 3 years of podcasting. The hardest part is the art of conversation.
Well, we cheat because there's two of us. So if one of us runs out of questions, the other one will find something to fill in. And that really, we've relied on that a lot.
Well, and we also do a fair amount of research to the extent we can on people we interview before we interview them. We'll listen to, if they've had any presentations they've done on YouTube, read newspaper articles about them, sometimes read a book they've written. So we have a pretty good idea of where the interview is going ahead of time and what types of questions we'll ask, what topics we'll discuss.
But you brought up something that we've run into many times. Like setting this up with you was really easy, and somebody suggested this date and this time, and okay, we're all good. And sometimes it goes that fast and that easily, but sometimes
usually not actually. Yeah.
We have had guests on our show who we've had to work on for like 3 years before we could get a date set up. And that frankly gets annoying. A month or two, fine, but years gets challenging.
Yeah, people don't realize the time that this takes. It's not just the editing and doing the interview. It's setting it up. It's looking for people to interview, answering questions when people say, I want to be interviewed on your show, and doing the research. It just takes a lot of time. Setting up the website, setting up the podcast, setting up YouTube. It's very time consuming. Fortunately, we're retired.
And
Yeah.
fortunately, I have a lot of teaching experience. And fortunately, I just love everything about doing this. Like, just talking to you guys just makes me happier. So I just want to do it. But
Yep.
yeah, podcasting would really suck if you hated it, because it is a lot of energy to actually create content that,
But
other
this
people-
has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for contacting us.
Yeah.
Well,
And
thank
if people
you.
want to
Well-
listen, they should go to www.eyesonsuccess.net. And we have our full searchable archive there if they want to listen to any of our over 600 shows.
Fantastic. I was just about to say, I'll end it by saying, so if someone wants to get in touch with you guys personally, how would they do that?
Well, the website is, as Pete said,
Right.
www.eyesonsuccess.net. And you can always reach us both by sending an email to hosts@eyesonsuccess.net.
And if you go to our website, there is that information on how to send us a note. Also, you can sign up for our weekly announcement list, where there's links to that week's show and the show notes and a summary of that show.
And we're on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, and just search for Eyes on Success.
And Alexa and Google.
Very good. It's been an honor to speak to both of you. Keep up your great work. Keep podcasting. Don't stop. You guys are doing magnificent, magnificent work. You guys, and both of you, are forever part of Aaron's Opinion. Don't worry, you didn't lose me that easily. You guys are forever sucked into my vortex of knowledge and podcasting. You're forever welcome here. Keep up your great work. And as I say on Aaron's Opinion, do you guys know how I end?
I do not.
Oh, that's totally fine. Thanks so much, everybody. Stay safe out there. Help one person today. Help 1 million people tomorrow.